setup of the story was really funny with that.
Yeah, and I agree with that too. It is that is actually really funny. But one of the things that we got to keep in mind too, I know we already said it's by men for men, but another thing to think about is the the actors are all also men. So you have men portraying women, and you have to think about when one sex, pretends to be or plays another. Usually, it's like over the top. So I can only imagine what these men were doing with prosthetics and like how they were acting, just visualizing grown men dressed as women, trying to portray women in that way. I don't think they did it in a tasteful fashion, probably. So that's something I kept thinking about while I'm reading the play, and I'm like, the female chorus strips naked, and I'm like, it's just a bunch of dudes fighting another bunch of naked dudes on stage. So I don't know. That was another aspect of the gender thing I was thinking about in the show.
Ooh, next question. How does a Greek comedy produce catharsis as defined in the Poetics? Devin?
Um, Greek comedies can create catharsis, but not technically as defined in Aristophanes' Poetics. Catharsis, as we know, is the cleaning or the purging of emotions such as pity or fear and stuff. And the audience can experience that, but for it to be experienced, catharsis to be experienced as defined in the Poetics, there has to be a tragic fall for one of the characters. And we don't have that in Lysistrata. I mean, everybody just kind of wins at the end. There's no big fall. So, in terms of through the poetics, as defined in the poetics, no, I don't think this produces catharsis in as defined in the poetics, just based on that lack of falling alone.
I'll chime in. Um, I do agree with the point that you're making. Um, I think like if we're going like by the textbook definition of what Aristophanes wanted, there wouldn't be like it doesn't meet the parameters of really allowing the audience to have catharsis. Um, but I do think that it's some like especially towards the end, thinking about it in the context of how the audience would have been, which would have been an audience of men, they may have viewed like the men succumbing to the women's wishes as some sort of a, I guess, fall of some sort. Um, Modern audiences may not agree with that sentiment, but I don't know. I also think potentially like going with that same idea, um, that same male audience could also view the men who are unable to achieve their sexual desires. Ultimately, they may pity them truly, just from a very surface level viewing of the show without looking any like further into the depth of the context of the show.
Yeah, for me, one reason why it's so different,
Very
and that you can't
like
really achieve catharsis in a show like
viewing.
this is is because, sorry, I think there was like some feedback, is some like the different stakes between a tragedy and a comedy. Comedies just don't have as high of stakes to give the feeling of purging your emotions and purging your fear. And it doesn't really contain the right characters to be able to achieve that effect in this comedy.
Next question. Is catharsis from comedy similar, different, slash able to be compared to catharsis from tragedy? And could it produce a slightly different kind of catharsis? Lisa?
Yeah, back to me again. So, it's really difficult to look at that because catharsis, as defined in the Poetics, is the whole first half was made for tragedy, and we don't have the second half to look at what Aristotle would have thought of catharsis in comedies as in depth. Um, so catharsis isn't just purging emotions, it's purging fear specifically. and we can't witness the fall of a character in a comedy nearly as much as a tragedy because tragedies are built up to have that fall for the character. So it is a lot more difficult to be able to experience a feeling of catharsis because if you do get that feeling, it's more likely that it's going to be in a smaller character in a comedy from what I have found. And more often in comedies, I feel like we're looking to make a better citizen, so self improvement, rather than purging feelings like we would get in a tragedy. So we wouldn't go to see a comedy to get the feeling of catharsis.
I can go again for this one. Um, Also, kind of talking about like what you were saying, like there isn't the stakes that are needed for that character to have like a truly effective fall that the audience will actually like resonate with. And something that I've noticed in comedies is just across the board the consequences just are not as severe. Specifically in Lysistrata, like the decision that or the thing that the women make oaths for is abstinence, which abstinence, depending on how the play is written, could be a very severe consequence. But the way that it's portrayed in this particular show, it's not. And then it's kind of made light of at certain points throughout the play. And then, so generally, like the consequences of what the men will not get if they don't agree to the women's terms aren't nearly as severe as it would have been in a tragedy.
I definitely agree that
So
there's like a different type of catharsis.
um,
In Aristotle's Poetics, Aristotle
yeah,
mentions that the definition of a good tragedy was the impact of catharsis on the audience, which is an emotional release for the audience. Aristotle does not mention catharsis in comedies and focuses on the emotional release through fear and pity in tragedies. But for comedies like Lysistrata, I think the audience still experiences an emotional release, but it's through laughter and through lighthearted playfulness. I think the audience can release their emotions through that laughter, expressing their connections to the themes in the play. For example, in Lysistrata, the audience emotions about the war can be transformed into the laughter, and in that way, they can kind of do an emotional cleansing through that. So I think that tragic catharsis and comedic catharsis both entail emotional release, but in different ways, and they both cleanse their emotions in that way.
Next question. How do many modern adaptations of Lysistrata as female empowerment pieces misread the play?
um, I have not personally come in contact with any specific examples of modern adaptations of the play, but just from my inference of what it could look like, they would probably misinterpret it by having some like portraying Lysistrata for in a way of actually having some sort of real power to create any sort of political or social change. Um, Really, the only power that women have at this time is being seen as sexual desires and sexual objects by men. Um, so Lysistrata uses that as her way of like gaining, her ideal outcome, but she doesn't actually change the minds of the men. She doesn't actually change anything of how society is being run or how women are viewed. She's really just using the one thing that gives her value to then get the men to make decisions on their behalf. So,
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like you, I haven't seen any modern productions of Lysistrata, but um, I think that they would change it in the comedic value into a more serious tone, focusing on the feminism part of it. However, the modern interpretations need to keep in mind the context and the history behind Lysistrata. During Aristophanes' time, women attempting to have political power was seen as comedic due to the gender roles then. The historical audiences viewed the lying and over sexual nature of the play as comedic rather than a dramatic moment of female empowerment. So, because of that, and also I think that it is possible that the overabundance sexual nature of the men were seen as comedic back then, and now it may be seen as inappropriate and a need for female empowerment. So they modern interpretations can change the tone from comedic to tragic by or dramatic by like altering that and focusing on the feminism, but they need to keep in mind the history behind it and the context of when Aristophanes wrote the play.
Yeah, I that's a great point, Micaiah. Like how in the context of the play, like Lysistrata really wouldn't have had a whole lot of real power. I mean, even by the end of the play, the women are they return to kind of just how things were before. Nothing really changes for the woman. I looked at it as a slightly different angle, kind of similar to Nathan's, where I kind of looked at it as like modern adaptations would misread it by ignoring how it would have been produced and received in ancient Greece when it premiered. As we've talked about before, every female character in the show would have been played by a man, which to me kind of dilutes any feminist stance the play could be taking. The playwright, actors, and it's not entirely sure whether or not the audience would have had women. I'm honestly assume it wouldn't have had women. So the playwright, actors, and audience would have all been men. So it's kind of hard to really champion this play as like a feminist piece while knowing not like a single woman was ever involved in its creation or its consumption.
Good points. Next question. Is it ethical to change the historical meaning of the play to fit current social ideas/norms?
In my opinion, changing the meaning of Lysistrata can be ethical, but they need to keep that comedic value that the Aristophanes intended it to be. The societal norms and the cultures change as time progresses, so some comedic moments of the play historically might not be viewed as the same in modern day. This is how many modern interpretations, just like answered in the last question, alter the comedic impact to a more dramatic impact because the view of women having political power was seen as a lot less common than it is modern day. However, even though the societal norms have changed, the production can still show the comedy in ways that the modern audiences can relate to. For example, instead of listing Cleon as the corrupt politician, modern audiences can use people the audience would recognize and relate to. When I think of that, I think of like using memes or using something that is currently trending on social media, like TikTok. That way, the audience recognizes that comedy and can laugh and relate to it. So in that way, they can still experience the comedic catharsis through the recognition of the comedy, which is a big part of the comedy is recognizing something and then expressing and cleansing your emotions through laughing through it. Another example of maintaining the comedy in modern productions would be to alter the sexual comedy to modern times, such as instead of banning sex, maybe banning dating apps or banning some other form of technology that's used in modern day, like pornography or something like that. Modern adaptations can also include modern societal norms to add to the humor. When I think of this, I think of so like the men and the women can't interact with one another, and then maybe there's like a few gay characters that joke about how the band doesn't affect them, and they just continue off being sexual with one another, something like that, and the list goes on and on. So there are many different ways that the modern adaptations can still produce Lysistrata while keeping that comedic element.
I'll comment on that. I guess I kind of have, I don't know, a very like I kind of looked at it a different way. I said, well, I don't believe it's necessarily like unethical to change the meaning. I personally wouldn't recommend it in Lysistrata's case. I kind of felt like art is created to serve a specific purpose within a specific time period or cultural moment. And so to change the meaning of the play in order to have it fit the current social ideas kind of defeats the purpose of why the play was created in the first place. Lysistrata was created with specifically with the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in mind, a war that only occurred because of the unique circumstances of ancient Greek society. And so because it only occurred at that one point, those circumstances can kind of never be replicated at any other point in human history. And so I think often people kind of might respond to that by saying like, well, history repeats itself. But I kind of like to think of it as like history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. So